Please, the pain, it is too much.
There are deaths that come from swords. There are empires that collapse because of rebellion. But there was one dynasty, as magnificent, as terrifying, and as heavy as a crown of gold and jewels, that began to disintegrate from a single wound. One ulcer, nothing more. And the man who bore it was the most famous king in England's history, Henry VIII. We usually remember him for his 6 wives, for the break with the Roman Church, for the cold-blooded way he signed death warrants as if they were dinner receipts. But few know that his final years were defined not by battles or plots, but by pain, pus, and the stench of his own body. The leg, once the symbol of power as he rode and hunted, became the birthplace of a silent horror, eating through both the Tudor throne and the mind of the man who sat on it. When Henry was 45, a seemingly trivial accident changed everything. In a joust, his favourite sport, the king fell from his horse. Not only did he fall, the armoured warhorse crashed down on him. In that instant, the scream that rose was not a salute to death, but the overture to a symphony of decay that would last almost a decade. Henry lay unconscious. Ladies, Courtier, and his wife Anne Boleyn, pregnant at the time, feared he would not survive. That very moment, many wrote later, caused Anne to miscarry. A child never born, a dream never formed, and a wound never healed that began to devour them all. No one imagined that from one fall Henry would never again be the same man. He lived. Yes. But to watch his body betray him day by day, his leg, the broken one, began to suppurate. Ulcers appeared, spreading wider, stinking more. Blood leaked through the fabric. Fluids oozed out as if his inner organs were trying to escape the royal flesh. And the smell, a stench so strong that courtiers wrapped wet cloths around their noses before entering his chamber. A smell that could make an infant cry as it passed the corridor. A smell that made maids faint. Chroniclers wrote that it travelled through 3 rooms, but this wound ate more than flesh. It consumed his mind. It dripped suspicion into the heart of a once brilliant king. It poured fury onto those who dared mention it. A casual remark about the king's poor leg could cost a head on the scaffold. From then on, a court trembled before. A leg. Not the Pope. Not foreign invaders. But a single ulcer. Small, yet omnipotent. Henry had once been the model of a perfect sovereign. Young, strong, learned, athletic. At 20 he weighed 210 pounds. His waist, a mere 32 inches. Enough to make foreign envoys write about the beauty of his figure as though he were a living statue. But after the injury he no longer rode, no longer played, no longer hunted. He only ate, drank, hurt, and punished. His waist grew from 32 inches to 52. His weight from 210 to over 300. He became a heavy slab of flesh, wrapped in velvet, decomposing slowly inside. No one dared speak. No one dared advise. No one dared try new treatments. The royal physicians, though they attempted to cauterize the ulcers with red-hot irons, without anesthetic, without any pain relief, only made the wound worse. The more they burned, the more the flesh charred. The more it charred, the more the stench rose, and that stench gradually became not only the smell of his body, but the symbol of the Tudor dynasty's decay. Imagine it, a monarch with unchecked power, who defied Rome itself, now imprisoned by his own leg. He could not go far in the sun. His doctors warned. He was carried in a wooden chair. He had to be hoisted onto a horse. And with each slow, awkward movement, he heard an invisible reminder, your time is running out. Yet there is something worse than death. To know you are rotting each day and no one dares to tell you. Living in absolute power, Henry also died in absolute silence, a silence enforced by fear, by law, and by his own cruelty. And this is only the beginning. The next parts will take you deeper, into the private room where blood soaked the sheets, where courtiers wept without sound, where wives arrived and departed like items on a menu, where the decay of a body mirrored the decay of the mightiest throne in Europe. This is not a story about medicine. It is a story about rot, from the leg to the crown and into history. Do you still want to go on? Because that leg has not yet revealed all its truth. The year was 1536. The corridors of Whitehall still echoed with the sounds of a restless monarch, Henry VIII. Then, in the prime of his middle age, still large, still looming, still feared. But in the eyes of those closest to him, a quiet dread had begun to take root. For that year would come to be remembered not by wars or treaties, not by marriages or births, but by a single moment, a single fall that changed not just Henry's body, but the very heart of England's crown. On a January afternoon, beneath banners flapping in the cold wind and cheers rising from the court, Henry mounted his warhorse for yet another jousting match. The king loved sport. He loved victory, but above all, he loved being seen, admired, worshipped. He entered the arena not as a man, but as an idol cast in flesh and velvet. The trumpet sounded, the horses charged, and then, in a blink, it all went wrong. Sir Henry Norris, his opponent, his courtier, and possibly more entwined in his personal affairs than he should have been, met him in the lane. Henry lunged but missed. The lance shattered against empty air, and his balance gave way. His warhorse, startled and massive, reared, and with all its weight and armour, collapsed backward. Onto him, the crown that had once challenged Rome now lay crushed beneath the hooves of his own beast. The court gasped. His guards ran, but Henry didn't rise. For minutes that stretched like hours, he lay motionless in the dirt, eyes closed, face pale, blood mixing with the churned mud. Panic erupted. Courtiers screamed, and somewhere in the women's gallery, Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, pregnant with what she hoped would be the long-awaited male heir, witnessed the fall, witnessed it, and lost her child. History tells us that Anne Boleyn miscarried shortly afterward. But those who were there, who watched the blood drain from her face even before it drained from her womb, spoke of something deeper than shock. It was as if the very soul of the kingdom had cracked. Henry's body was broken, Anne's hope was broken, and the illusion of invincibility that had cloaked the Tudor court was, from that day forward, gone. Henry survived. Yes, but something inside him did not. At first, his injuries seemed manageable. Fractures, bruises, exhaustion. He was confined to bed. Physicians murmured. Courtiers prayed. But as days turned to weeks, a new enemy emerged slow, seeping, and merciless. Ulcers began to form on his leg, just below the knee. Small at first, then spreading, angry, red, weeping. The skin around them blackened. The smell grew sharp. The pain constant. And worst of all, they would not heal. The Tudor physicians tried everything known to man and myth. Herbal poultices, honey salves, boiled liniments, bloodletting, retirance. Nothing worked. The ulcers deepened, digging into muscle, exhaling a stench that no walls could contain. Visitors gagged. Servants avoided his chamber. And the king, the once proud lion of England, began to limp. But it wasn't just his gait that changed. His mind shifted too. Where Henry had once been decisive, now he was impulsive. Where he had once been indulgent, now he was cruel. The pain twisted his thoughts. The constant discomfort made him volatile. Those who served him soon learned that his mood could sour in a moment, and his fury was no longer theatrical. It was lethal. 6 months after the accident, he ordered Anne Boleyn's arrest. Of course, history wraps it in layers of treason, adultery, incest, a cascade of charges that still fill textbooks and court dramas. But many believe the true reason lay not in Anne's imagined betrayals, but in her failure to deliver a son, and in the emotional spiral that had gripped Henry since the accident. He had nearly died. His leg was rotting. His dreams of a male heir were crumbling. And Anne, once the flame of his rebellion, had become a reminder of pain, loss, and weakness. He signed her death warrant with the same hand that gripped his cane. On May 19th, Anne Boleyn, crowned queen just 3 years earlier, was beheaded by a French swordsman on Tower Green. Her marriage to Henry had already been annulled the day before, as if to cleanse his conscience with legal formality. And 10 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour, the woman who would finally give him his longed-for son, and die in the process. All of this, the fall, the miscarriage, the murder, the remarriage, happened in the span of 5 months. A single spring that rewrote the course of Tudor history. And at the centre of it all, behind the thrones and beds and scaffolds, was a festering leg that would not heal. They began calling it the King's Annus Horribilis, his horrible year. But for Henry, the horror was only beginning. By the end of that year, his ulcer had returned deeper, darker, and more resistant than ever. The pain was so great that he could no longer ride. He could barely walk. When he did appear in public, he had to mask his agony with forced smiles and robes scented with lavender to cover the smell. His meals grew heavier, his temper shorter, and those who served him began to whisper behind doors they hoped were thick enough. The king is not what he was.
No.
In truth, he was becoming something else entirely. Gone was the dashing prince who once danced with Catherine of Aragon, composed music, and sparred for sport. In his place stood a bloated monarch with a rotting leg, a heart full of suspicion, and a list of enemies that grew longer with every new dressing on his wound. And yet, no one dared name it. No one dared look directly at the wound, metaphorical or physical. It became the court's invisible tyrant, a sore that dictated law, love, and execution. If a courtier made a joke too close to the truth, he vanished. If a servant complained about the smell, he was dismissed. If a noble hinted that the king looked weaker than before, he might lose his title or his head. Henry's pain ruled the palace. And so that year, 1536, became more than just a year of tragedy. It became the birth of a new kind of king, not one made strong by triumph, but made dangerous by decay. A monarch whose body betrayed him, and who, in return, betrayed everyone else. A king whose footsteps echoed not with power, but with the slow, wet sound of rot. And that was just the beginning. Because what happens when the most powerful man in the realm begins to fall apart slowly, painfully, visibly? What happens when the infection is no longer just in the flesh, but in the laws, the marriages, the judgments, and the air of the court itself? You'll see, in the next part, we'll step further into the sick room, into the chambers where pain became power, and where Henry VIII began to use his rotting body not as a burden, but as a weapon, one that bled not only onto bandages, but into history itself. By the time the court entered the winter of 1537,
Your Majesty.
the wound on Henry's leg was no longer a medical condition. It had become a presence, a spirit that hovered over council meetings, haunted banquet halls, and settled like a sour mist behind the heavy curtains of the king's private chambers. For it no longer throbbed only beneath the royal flesh, but bled quietly into everything. The crown touched every policy, every marriage, every death. Though the initial swelling had subsided after Anne Boleyn's death, and Jane Seymour's short-lived queenship. The ulcer had returned before spring, deeper this time, darker, and less interested in healing than in claiming its space. And with it, the king's days and nights. For even the simplest movement, even a slow walk from bed to chair, could cause a hot flash of agony to shoot through his thigh, causing his vision to blur and his hands to tremble with the effort of not roaring in pain in front of his physicians. And thus, to maintain the illusion of control, Henry began to withdraw not only from the public eye, but from his own body, speaking of it as though it were a battlefield on which he, the general, could issue orders, but over which he held no command. It was around this time that the king's humour, once famous for its bawdy warmth, turned sullen and sharp. His laughter, rare and bitter, often followed by sudden dismissals, or worse, arrests. And the courtiers learned quickly that to mention the king's health was to gamble with one's life, while even the act of offering him assistance, a hand as he stood, a whispered, "Are you well?" Majesty could lead to a chilling silence, a narrowed glare, and within days, a transfer to some distant posting or a polite but permanent exile from court. But it was not only the ulcer that spread, it was the fear of it. The unspeakable horror of watching the most powerful man in England slowly, visibly, and painfully decompose while still ruling with full authority. For as the leg worsened, so too did the king's paranoia, his isolation, and his tendency to rule through instinct rather than counsel, trusting less and punishing more, signing death warrants with a grim finality, as though each signature were not the end of a man, but a small release valve for the mounting pressure of pain inside his own skin. There were days when the smell from the king's chambers was so foul that tapestries were soaked in rosewater and cloves, and braziers of sweet herbs were lit and left to burn in corridors. Yet nothing could mask the odour entirely, and those closest to the sovereign learned to breathe shallowly or to speak with handkerchiefs discreetly pressed to their noses. For it was said that the king's ulcer could be smelled long before he could be seen as slow warning, like the stench before the storm. And with it came a silence, more chilling than any spoken order. The leg itself, treated daily by royal physicians whose tools were more akin to blacksmiths than to healers, had become a grotesque landscape of dead flesh, cracked skin, and pockets of pus, which would sometimes burst without warning during meetings, soaking through bandages and silks alike, leading one ambassador to report privately that the king shifts as though sitting on fire, and stares into the void as though somewhere behind his eyes lives a beast gnawing at the bones of his patients. And while this may sound like exaggeration, those who attended to him in private confessed, many years later, that they had once feared he might try to cut the leg off himself in a fit of despair, and only the presence of guards, and the dulling effects of too much wine, prevented such madness. Still, perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the wound was not what it did to Henry's body, but what it did to his judgment. For the king, who had once spent hours in theological debate and literary patronage, now seemed unable to focus on anything that did not directly concern his pleasure, his pain, or his legacy. And as his leg grew worse, so did his appetite for loyalty, demanding oaths from his closest allies, letters of devotion from his remaining wives, and increasingly absolute obedience from the Parliament, whose laws now reflected not the needs of the people, but the shifting, infected will of a man at war with his own mortality. It was during this period that executions became more frequent and more personal, for it was no longer treason in the legal sense that brought men to the block, but treason, in the psychological sense, a look too pitiful, a murmur too doubtful, or the mere suggestion that the king's health might be compromising his wisdom. And those condemned under these new unspoken laws often confessed nothing, not because they were innocent or defiant, but because they genuinely had no idea what they had done wrong, save perhaps for being present on the wrong day, in the wrong mood, with the wrong face. Among the most chilling examples was the downfall of Thomas Cromwell, the very architect of the Reformation and Henry's closest advisor who, after years of service, was suddenly accused of heresy, treason, and the usual litany of crimes hastily gathered for political assassinations. And though some historians blame Cromwell's fall on the disastrous marriage alliance with Anne of Cleves, others whisper that it was something far simpler, that Cromwell had made a comment innocuous, perhaps, or ill-timed, about the need to reduce the king's physical strain during negotiations. And in that instant, his fate was sealed, not by policy, but by a wound. And yet, the world beyond the palace saw little of this decay, for portraits continued to be painted carefully idealized, the king standing firm, clad in crimson and ermine, his legs obscured beneath heavy robes, his face serene, while foreign envoys were given scripted audiences, limited to 15 minutes, where the king would sit motionless, perfumed, and grimacing behind a forced smile, then vanish again into the darkened apartments where his real kingdom, the kingdom of fever, bandages, and silence continued its rule. There were, of course, attempts at healing foreign doctors, secret remedies, even whispered discussions of magical cures, but all failed. And in failing, they merely fed the legend of the ulcer, transforming it from an ailment into an omen. And as the years passed, courtiers began to wonder, not if the king would die from it, but whether England itself would be infected by it, for the realm now seemed governed not by a man, but by the moods and madness of a leg that refused to close, to stop, to die, and so the wound remained, pulsing, silent, ever present a rot beneath the crown, a poison beneath the laws,
It is too
a ghost
much.
beneath the skin of history. In the next part, we will see how this ghost reached beyond the body, how it haunted marriages, crushed alliances, and taught an entire kingdom to kneel not before wisdom, but before fear, as Henry VIII became not merely a monarch, but a living warning of what happens when power refuses to die, even as the flesh that holds it turns black. By the time England entered the decade that followed the accident, the slow-motion decade of rot, dread, and irreversible decline, the throne itself had begun to reek, not just metaphorically, as the burden of Henry's paranoia grew heavier, but quite literally, as the scent of festering ulcers began to hang in the very air of the royal presence chamber, soaking into the velvet cushions, the woolen carpets, and even into the silence between sentences, spoken too carefully by men, too afraid to breathe too deeply. And it was during this period that the royal court transformed from a place of counsel and governance into a suffocating theatre of survival, where every glance, every whisper, and every step might be interpreted as rebellion if it drifted too close to the truth that the king was dying by inches, and that England was dying with him, though his voice still boomed across halls when he chose to use it, and though his seals still pressed judgments into wax with terrifying authority. The man who sat upon the throne had ceased to be a sovereign in the traditional sense, and had become instead something closer to a shrine of power, untouchable, unreadable, and increasingly unapproachable. A figure surrounded not by statesmen and scholars, but by apothecaries, priests, and servants who no longer served so much as endured. For Henry's wound had become not just an affliction but a regime unto itself, dictating not only the hours of the day and the routes he could walk, but the laws he would sign and the people he would destroy. And so the throne upon which he sat, once a symbol of divine right and earthly order, now functioned more like a padded prison, one upholstered in crimson but soaked through with fear. Even the act of entering his presence became a ritual of calculation and dread, for one never knew what mood might await behind the oak doors of the privy chamber. And it was understood, though never spoken aloud, that the closer one stood to the king, the more likely one was to fall, not through disfavor in any rational sense, but through a sudden shift in tone, an unexpected wince of pain, or the twitch of an eyebrow that meant the ulcer was acting up. And when the ulcer acted up, heads rolled. It was during this time that even those closest to Henry began to disappear, not with ceremony or disgrace, but with eerie efficiency, removed from court by royal order, their names struck from records, their faces quietly forgotten, and often their only crime was being present when the king's pain became unbearable, for pain has no mercy, and neither did Henry. And when the fire under his skin flared too bright, he would burn those around him without warning, reducing friendships, loyalties, and decades of service into ash with a single stroke of the pen. The throne, then, became less a seat of judgment and more a crucible of contagion, for no man who stood too long beside it could escape the slow, sickening influence of its occupant. And those who tried to reason with the king to suggest reforms, to question expenditures, to even mention the word health, found themselves branded enemies of the realm. For in Henry's eyes, his wound was no longer an illness, but a secret war, and anyone who acknowledged it became a traitor to his authority. For, to say the king is suffering was, in his mind, to say the king is weak, and to say that was to court death. And yet, despite the terror that thickened the air of court like a vapor rising from the ulcer itself, the machine of monarchy continued to function, or at least, to lurch forward in grotesque imitation of function fueled not by vision or policy, but by the terrified obedience of those who understood that the safest answer to any question was silence, and that the surest path to survival was invisibility. For ambition had become dangerous, truth had become fatal, and even compassion, a kind word, a concerned expression, could be misread as disloyalty by a sovereign whose pain had turned him into both judge and executioner. What was once the most glittering court in Europe had become a wax museum of fear, its courtiers drifting through corridors with the haunted expressions of men who had seen too much and dared say too little. And at the center of it all sat Henry vast, swollen, and furious, his body now so heavy that special chairs had to be constructed with reinforced arms to support him, his legs bandaged in layers of linen that soaked through daily, and his expression increasingly unreadable, as if the ulcer had not only hollowed out his flesh, but had reached up into his skull, eating at the man who once composed songs, who once quoted Latin verse, and who now could not go 3 days without signing a death warrant. And the throne that object once forged to hold the weight of a kingdom began to sag beneath him, not in structure, but in spirit, for it had ceased to inspire awe and had begun instead to summon dread. And in time, foreign ambassadors began to speak of the court not as a seat of power, but as a place of decay, a tomb wrapped in velvet, where policy was dictated not by reason, but by infection, and where no one knew whether tomorrow might bring a feast, a var, or a beheading. For the king himself no longer governed by will, but by wound. There are records, of course, of specific laws passed during this period, new taxes, new appointments, new edicts against dissenters. But if one reads closely, one sees not the hand of governance, but the tremor of agony behind them, the desperation of a man trying to reassert control not over his subjects, but over his own mortality. And so he built palaces he could not climb, the stairs of married wives he would outlive or discard, and collected titles and artifacts with the urgency of someone who feared that to stop moving, even for a moment, would be to acknowledge the rot spreading under his skin. And all the while, the smell persisted. It clung to him in court, in bed, in chapelle. It curled into the folds of his garments. It followed him down every hallway, and it preceded him into every room, until the very scent of power in England was no longer lavender or rosewater, but the sour, coppery stench of infection, a smell that no herald could drown out, that no decree could mask, and that no prayer could lift, for the throne of England now bore not only the weight of a king, but the weight of his suffering, and as we shall see in the next part, that suffering would not remain confined to flesh or fabric, but would infect the very structure of England's future, reaching beyond the grave, staining crowns, poisoning heirs, and ensuring that no monarch could ever sit upon it again without hearing, somewhere deep in the silence of rule, the echo of a leg that refused to heal. There comes a point in every man's life, even kings, especially kings, when the throne no longer matters as much as the bed. And for Henry VIII, that moment arrived, not with ceremony or announcement, but with a soft groan muffled by velvet sheets, and the faint rustle of bandages being removed once again from a leg that refused to surrender. And it was in the dim, the heavy air of his bedchamber, not in court, not in council, not in chapel, that the war of his final years was fought. A war not of armies or doctrines, but of flesh and will. A war between a dying body and a still demanding crown. Between a man who could no longer rise and a nation that still waited for him to lead. By this time, the ulcer had ceased to be a wound in any conventional sense, for it no longer followed the rhythms of healing or infection, of progress or relapse. It had become a permanent condition, like the weight of the crown itself, and those who tended to it did so with a kind of resigned reverence, as though they were no longer treating a medical issue, but performing a sacrament. The dressing and redressing of the king's leg having transformed into a daily ritual as solemn and terrifying as any mass, with the smell of rotting tissue mingling with incense, and the muffled sounds of pain echoing beneath the carved beams of a bed that had once been built for pleasure but now groaned with agony. The bed, massive and ornate, carved from oak and inlaid with gold, had once been the site of seductions and triumphs, of whispered vows and royal conceptions, but now it served as a sort of mobile throne, the place from which Henry issued orders, received courtiers, and even, on occasion, held audiences. For there were days, many days, when he simply could not stand, could not bear the pressure of gravity on the wound that had grown into a crater of red and black and yellow, slick with fluids that no cloth could contain for long. And so he ruled from bed, propped up by pillows, his bulk supported by carefully positioned cushions, his leg raised, exposed, and perpetually in need of care. And it was from that position, half king, half corpse, that Henry began to remake the rituals of power around his own suffering, so that attendance at his bedside became a marker of status. The privilege of being summoned into the room where he lay no longer a matter of intimacy, but of proximity to pain. And those admitted quickly learned that the tone of the day would be set not by protocol, but by the leg, whether it had bled that morning, whether the skin had cracked during the night, whether the fever had returned. And every audience began, not with a bow, but with a sniff, an instinctive inhalation of the air, to determine what kind of Henry would be waiting: the snarling one, the silent one, or on rare days the Henry who still laughed, though even that laugh had become brittle, tinged with desperation, as if he himself could hear how close it sat to the edge of a scream. Physicians came and went, summoned from across the realm and beyond, each bringing their own salves, their own theories, their own cautious optimism, and each leaving eventually, inevitably in defeat, for the ulcer yielded to no herb, no prayer, no balm, and though some tried cautery, burning the edges in hopes of sealing the wound with flame. The result was always the same: more pain, more stench, and more despair. And it was not uncommon for Henry to lash out mid-treatment, to curse the very men trying to save him, to accuse them of betrayal, or witchcraft, or incompetence. For what else could explain a leg so determined to ruin him, so impervious to authority, so indifferent to divine right? In time, the bed itself had to be modified, reinforced, widened, its posts recarved to allow for pulley systems and slings, for Henry could no longer turn without assistance. And the act of rising, of sitting, of standing, required multiple attendants, ropes, and leverage, a spectacle so undignified that only the most trusted were allowed to witness it. And even they often turned away, not just out of respect, but out of sheer human discomfort, for there is something deeply unsettling about watching a king be lifted like a piece of broken furniture, and something worse about hearing him grunt with effort and rage as he tries, one more time, to prove that he is not yet dead. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this battlefield was not the physical one, not the bed, the blood, the bandages, but the psychological terrain that stretched around it, the emotional no-man's land in which those who loved or served the king had to navigate each hour with the precision of soldiers avoiding landmines. For the king, who once charmed foreign queens and bested French knights, had become a man who distrusted kindness, who feared pity, who saw every gesture of concern as a reminder that he was no longer whole. And so his bed became a place of emotional exile, where his wives sat in silence, afraid to touch him, and his children entered with caution, unsure whether to kneel, or rimbrassi, or simply back away. And yet, in this strange and terrible space, Henry remained king. He signed laws from that bed. He commanded executions. He dictated treaties. He received ambassadors. He married. He mourned. He plotted. He dreamed. And through it all, the leg wept day after day, year after year, soaking into linens, staining mattresses, marking the passage of time not in days or seasons, but in ounces of pus and inches of flesh lost. And still the world outside went on. Still, England bowed to the crown. Still, the bells of Westminster rang, oblivious to the slow undoing happening in that darkened room behind velvet curtains and perfumed smoke. By the time Henry entered the final years of his life, the bed had become both cradle and coffin, the only place he could sleep, I think, rage, and sometimes, though rarely, reflect. And those reflections, when they came, were often bitter, for he knew what he had become, knew that his body had betrayed him, that his people feared him, that his wives had either left him, died, or been sent to the block by his own hand. And though he never said it aloud, some believe that the way he stared into the candlelight, long after others had gone, was the closest he ever came to confession. Because what does a man like Henry, who had once been young, golden, and adored, see when he looks down at his own leg and finds not muscle, not strength, but rot? What does he feel when he realizes that the very instrument which once carried him to battle, to love, to glory, now anchors him to a bed he cannot leave? Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was fury. Perhaps it was nothing more than a long, simmering grief for youth, for power, for the illusion of control. But whatever it was, it clung to him, as thick as the ointment smeared on his skin, as heavy as the crown resting on a nearby table, untouchably now, because even lifting it would cause his wound to throb. And so the bed remained silent, bloodied, sacred, the final battlefield of a king who had conquered so many and been conquered. In the end, by himself. In the next part, we will descend into the shadow this bed cast over England, exploring how its occupant, unable to walk, began to drag the entire realm into a posture of silence, suspicion, and slow decay for the body of the king, once admired and envied, had become a symbol not of majesty, but of mortality, and the nation that once danced to his command now waited for a death too long in coming. There is a cruelty in lingering not the dramatic descent of a hero who falls in one swift motion, nor the noble silence of a monarch slipping into legend overnight, but the slow, grinding, breath by breath, decay of a body too stubborn to die and too broken to truly live. And Henry VIII, King of England, defender of the faith, scourge of Rome, lover, killer, builder, father, tyrant, legend, had become just that, a man trapped between the throne and the tomb, suspended by flesh that refused to fail fast enough, sustained not by strength or prayer, but by the sheer gravity of his own legend, refusing to release its hold on him. By the final years of his reign, Henry no longer walked, not in secret corridors, not in gardens, not even across the floors of the royal chapel, where once he had knelt in supposed humility, for the pain was constant now. Not a visitor that came and went, but a resident inside his body, gnawing at his leg, at his back, at his breath, until every gesture, every word, every heartbeat was filtered through that ever-present awareness of rot. And yet, still, he ruled from behind screens, from wheeled chairs, from a bed with carved posts that shook beneath the weight of his body and the weight of a realm teetering on the edge of something no one dared name. For though the king had grown grotesque, monstrously swollen, his face puffed and red with heat, his belly so distended he could not see his feet, his legs swaddled in dressings, soaked hourly with yellow discharge, he was still the king, and to speak of his condition in any tone other than reverent concern was to risk being erased not only from court, but from memory, because Henry had not only rewritten the laws of England, but the laws of mortality, insisting through will, ritual, and punishment that no one mentioned the possibility of death in his presence. And so he became the king who could not die, not because death did not approach, but because the court could not afford to look it in the eye. There were moments, of course, when the truth crept in during the night, when the groans could be heard through stone walls, when the physicians whispered of kidney failure and high fevers and rising blood sugar, when the pus turned black and the smell became unbearable even to the seasoned noses of his closest attendants, when the bleeding would not stop, when the urine turned red, when the king screamed without words, unable to be touched, unable to be moved. But even then, no one said it, no one dared write it down, and the royal chroniclers continued to document court ceremonies, hunting parties, baptisms, and gifts, as though the man who had not stood unassisted in years was still striding through the affairs of state, like the golden prince he once had been. Perhaps Henry believed it himself, or needed to, for he continued to marry, continued to eat, continued to sign decrees with a trembling hand and a scowl that still carried the authority of the axe, continued to summon nobles and frighten ambassadors and approve executions, even as his own body resembled the very prisoners he condemned, locked in place, festering, pleading silently for release. At one point, a new suit of armor was commissioned, ceremonial. Of course, never to be worn, never to be used in battle, but fashioned to fit his final shape. Its waist measured at 52 inches. Its joints widened to accommodate a man who could no longer bend, and though it gleamed with gold and crimson trim, no one could look upon it without imagining what it was meant to protect. Not a body ready for war, but a legacy the spirit for illusion. The king was no longer a man, but a myth that had overgrown its vessel, a living relic of a younger self who had outlived his wives, his rivals, and even his usefulness, but who would not, could not, to be removed until nature itself dragged him from the stage. He refused to leave. Even his servants began to look older, thinner, their faces drawn not just from fatigue, but from the emotional erosion of serving a master who no longer recognized days, who no longer tolerated delay, who could not tolerate contradiction, and who would smile in the morning and condemn in the afternoon depending on the swelling of a leg, the taste of a meal, or the echo of a dream that had left him feeling slighted. For Henry still dreamed or hallucinated, and the lines between the two had blurred long ago. It was said that in the hours before dawn, when the pain peaked and no opiate could dull it, he would whisper names into the darkness. Not prayers, not orders, but names: Catherine, Anne, Jane, Thomas, Cromwell, More, Elizabeth, Edward, and that sometimes he would mutter fragments of scripture, not in Latin, but in English, broken, resentful, as if still arguing with God, as if still unwilling to accept that the man who had torn England from the Pope's hand might one day be judged by a force even he could not behead. And yet,
This is good.
even in this state, gasping, decaying, weeping from the leg and the mouth and the eyes, he continued to plan. He met with councillors, dictated succession, rearranged titles, punished families whose loyalty faltered, promoted those who promised to remember him well. And above all, he tried again and again to secure the future of the dynasty he had built with blood, divorce, and fire. Edward was still a child, frail and untested. Mary was devout and dangerous. Elizabeth, the one who looked too much like Anne, was clever and silent. Henry wanted control, even of the world after his death. And so he dictated his will in layers: legal, symbolic, and spiritual, weaving a tapestry of commands that no one could fully understand, but that everyone would be forced to interpret once his breath finally failed. But it would not fail, not yet. Not then. Time and again, his physicians gathered around the bed, expecting an ending, only to find that the body, too ruined though it was, continued to fight, the heart beating with the stubborn rhythm of a man who had once outrun plague, betrayal, and prophecy. There was no dramatic collapse, no noble last word, just more nights, more moaning, more bandages, more blood, more waiting. And in that waiting, England held its breath, because when a king lingers too long on the edge of death, the kingdom itself begins to rot with him. Institutions stall, ambitions curdle, alliances rust, and the air becomes heavy with the weight of what must come, but will not come yet. And so the nobles postured and lied. The clergy prayed and pretended. The people speculated in whispers, and all the while, Henry lingered, not alive in the truest sense, but not yet dead. In the final sense, a monarch caught in a cruel purgatory of his own making, clinging to the power that had once given him everything, even as it now gave him nothing but pain. In the next part, we will step into that final twilight, the slow collapse of silence, the moment the body broke before the crown did, and the grim reality of how death finally claimed the king who had outrun it for too long, only to leave behind a legacy drenched in blood, secrets, and the smell of something far worse than fear: the truth. In the final winter of his reign, the walls of the royal chamber no longer echoed with the clamour of power, but instead absorbed a different kind of sound: the shallow, irregular breaths of a man whose body had long ago surrendered its dignity, the soft hissing of festering flesh being unwrapped for the last time, the quiet shuffle of servants who had forgotten how to walk normally, who moved like ghosts across polished floors, knowing that any misstep in volume or timing could awaken not only the king but the wrath that still impossibly, lived inside him. Because even now, as the month of January in the year 1547 froze the Thames and sent bitter winds howling through the cracks in Hampton Court's stone, the man they still called Majesty had not yet released his grip on the world, or on himself. It had been more than a decade since the accident, since the horse crushed his body and the ulcer rose like a second crown, silent at first, then demanding, then cruel. And now that same ulcer had swollen and spread until it had nearly consumed the entirety of his lower limb. The skin turned black and shiny, like lacquered leather. The stench, no longer something whispered about behind sleeves, but openly acknowledged by courtiers who wept and retched behind curtains. And yet still he breathed. He raged. He lingered. The court had long since stopped waiting for orders, and had begun instead waiting for silence. The kind of silence that could not be denied or defied. The kind of silence that came only once. And though ambassadors still came bearing gifts, though nobles still wore polished boots and brushed doublets, the ritual of monarchy had become nothing more than a carefully performed denial of the obvious that their king was dying and had been dying for years, but refused, against reason and flesh and mercy, to do it quickly. There were moments, long ones, when he would drift into fevered sleep, the whites of his eyes showing, his hands twitching beneath thick furs. And in those moments, the whispers would begin the succession. The boy king, the council, the queen dowager, the foreign alliances, everything would be spoken of except for the leg, which continued to ooze and crack open daily. A thing that had grown from infection into an identity. Because now no one could speak of the king without also remembering the smell. The scream. The swollen ankle glimpsed beneath torn linen. The nurse who fainted. The guard who vomited. The doctor who never returned. They say in those final weeks, the wound became sentient, not in the literal sense, but in the way that it commanded the room, dictated the mood, bent the behavior of everyone within its reach, as though it had become the true monarch, and Henry merely its host. And when the physicians opened the leg for the final time, attempting once more to drain the poisoned blood, what poured forth was not fluid, but silence. The kind that made men look at each other and understand, without saying it, that this was no longer a man being treated, but a monument being unmade from the inside out. By the second week of January, he could no longer speak without trembling, could no longer sit without assistance. And the royal bed, now stained beyond repair, had become a floating altar of pain, surrounded by priests who pretended to offer last rites without admitting they were doing so, because the king had never said he was dying, and to presume otherwise was still treason. Even if his voice was a rasp and his eyes glazed over more than they focused, when he did speak, it was in fragments, names, titles, memories, half prayer, half command, and once, one servant claimed, he whispered the word Anne, not with hatred, but something closer to regret, though no one dared ask which Anne he meant. And the room grew colder, even as the fires were stoked. The will had already been signed, sealed, locked away in a chest, so heavy it took 6 men to carry it. Its contents fiercely guarded. Its instructions precise and paranoid and filled with phrases that left even the most seasoned scribes uneasy. Because it was not just a document of succession, but of vengeance filled with protections for Edward. Warnings against Mary. Instructions on how to remember Henry, and how never to forget the power he wielded, even in his final decay. And yet, still, he did not die. The days blurred together like fog along the Thames, and the moon rose and fell over a palace that had grown too quiet. And outside, commoners lit candles, not in mourning, but in confusion, wondering what kept the great Lion of England from finally closing his eyes and letting go. Some whispered that it was divine punishment that a man who had ordered so many deaths could not find his own. Others said it was the leg, that the rot had kept him tethered like an anchor, unwilling to free him, determined to torment him to the very edge of madness before releasing its hold. But most, especially those who had served him longest, you knew the truth that Henry could not die, because he would not allow himself to not until every word had been spoken, every successor chosen, every enemy punished, every piece of the world bent into shape by the force of his collapsing will. And then, finally, on the 28th of January, in the year 1547, in the early hours before dawn, in a room that smelled of myrrh and flesh and smoke, Henry Tudor, the second of his name, the great, the terrible, the unforgettable, exhaled a final time, and did not inhale again. The chamber did not erupt into mourning. It did not fall into hysteria. It fell, instead, into silence. The kind of silence that only follows something that has been too loud for too long. The priests began to pray. The servants began to weep. The physicians, though they had seen it coming for years, stood still. And somewhere in the hallway beyond, a courtier whispered what many had feared to say for months: "The king is dead." But the story does not end with the breath, because the body, swollen and festering, had not finished its vengeance. The coffin would rupture. The embalming would fail. The rot would continue not just in the flesh but in the stories. The legacy. The children left behind to carry a burden too heavy to name. In the next part, we will follow what happened to the corpse, the crown, and the curse left in Henry's wake, the final unraveling of a king who took too long to die, and a kingdom that would take even longer to recover from him. Not every death brings peace. Not every death closes a chapter. Some deaths feel like the final rupture of something that had been rotting from within for far too long, not a release, not a conclusion, but a final insult. And the death of Henry VIII, once the most feared and adored man in England, was not a passing indignity, nor a ceremonial end to a storied reign, but a slow collapse into something that smelled far more like punishment than closure. A bodily surrender so grotesque that even those who had once worshipped him could not stand to be in the same room once the breathing stopped. The corpse did not rest quietly. From the moment he exhaled his last breath in the early hours of January the 28th in the year 1547, there was a problem no one dared to name out loud. The king's body, already decaying while still alive, now began to decompose with frightening speed. The leg, the ulcer, the wound that had defined the final decade of his life, had left behind a system overwhelmed by rot. And within hours the smell intensified to a level even the most hardened physicians could not endure, without covering their mouths and turning their heads away in shame and nausea. The bandages soaked through. The flesh beneath the linen bloated. The royal sheets, already stained by years of fever and seepage, were now useless. Perfumes could not mask the odor. Incense only layered sweet smoke over the sourness of death. His attendants, the ones who had once sworn they would follow him anywhere, now refused to touch the body without gloves and prayer. But the rituals had to go on. The king must be buried, and the king must be seen. The problem was how to move him. The body was placed in a lead-lined coffin, not for preservation, but for containment. They thought the seal would be enough, but even lead could not stop what was festering inside. As the cortege travelled from Whitehall to Windsor, the air grew colder, but the stench did not recede. Somewhere along the journey, the coffin began to leak. Not just condensation, not just the damp of a winter funeral, but actual black fluid, thick, pungent, and horrifying. A soldier later whispered that he had seen a trail on the church floor where the coffin had rested overnight. And in that very chapel, a stray dog, perhaps a real beast, perhaps a ghost from one of the king's thousands of executions, was said to have entered and licked at the puddle left behind before vanishing into the dark. No one wanted to confirm this story, but no one dared to deny it either. The funeral was held with full honors, Trumpets, choirs, heralds, the works. Dukes and bishops and lords in mourning black filed through the chapel. Heads bowed, the crown rested on a pillow before the altar. The royal arms draped the coffin, and yet not one person stood too close. Not one noble reached out. No tear stained a cheek that day out of affection. What filled the room was not grief, but discomfort, revulsion, and perhaps relief, for the body was sealed, and the smell, though heavy, was being dealt with. The room was warm, but the air was cold, because no one mourns a man they have been afraid of for 20 years. No one weeps for a monarch who ruled not through love, but through the fear of a leg that bled and never healed. Beyond the chapel walls, the people gathered in silence. Some bowed, some stared. Most said nothing. They stood there as if watching something that could still rise, half expecting a final roar. A last decree. The flailing of a dying lion who had already outlived his myths. But no sound came. Only dirt, falling softly on the coffin. Only the grim certainty that a chapter had closed. Not with glory, but with decay. The story, however, did not end with the burial. The rot did not stop at death. It lived on in the minds of those who had served him, the physicians who dreamed of his screams at night, the courtiers who had watched him bloat beyond human form, the scribes who had burned their notes, the noblewomen who had once kissed his hand and now could not bring themselves to speak his name. And then came the people. The legacy that followed was not the image of a golden prince or a wise lawgiver, but the whispered memory of the king with the rotten leg, the monarch who tried to outlive God, whose power had no equal, and yet whose body betrayed him more fully than any foreign enemy ever could. Parents began telling their children stories about the king who wouldn't die, who bled from his leg like a curse upon the throne, who lived too long and died too slowly, not in mockery, but in warning that no man, no matter how high he climbs, escapes the limits of the flesh, that no crown is strong enough to stop the stink of pride gone unchecked, and that even kings, when they refuse to admit they are broken, will die in the most humiliating way possible, not from war, not from poison, but from a wound they refuse to face. In the next and final part, we will step away from the man and into the shadow. He left behind a child king too small to wear the crown, a country uncertain how to heal, and a history forever stained by the man who ruled from behind a curtain of pain and would not let go until everything body, crown, and kingdom began to rot with him. The last lullaby is not a comfort. It is a reckoning. And so the story ends not with fire, not with war drums, not with a coronation or a rebellion, but with the slow hush that comes after something terrible has finally, mercifully stopped. The king is gone. The bed is empty. The corridors are quiet again. But even in his absence, something lingers, something heavy and unfinished. Because the truth is, Henry VIII never really left. Not entirely. He remained in the silence that followed his death, in the servants who still dreamed of the smell, in the throne that no longer carried the weight of a man but the burden of memory, and in the terrified way the nation stepped forward into its future, not boldly, not confidently, but with the stiff, unsure gait of someone walking on a wound that never quite closed. His son, little Edward, the long-awaited boy for whom queens had been replaced and blood had been spilled, was crowned at only 9 years old. Too young to rule, too frail to survive for long. And in that child's sunken eyes, the court saw not a new beginning but an echo of the past. The shadow of a father who had tried to shape the world in his own image and had ended up devoured by it. Mary came after, and then Elizabeth's daughters by different mothers, raised in opposite worlds, carrying pieces of a legacy stitched together with terror, and though they would reign long and boldly in their own right, they too were haunted by the throne that had once creaked under the weight of a dying king and a festering secret. Henry had tried to control death. He had rewritten the church to avoid the Pope. He had rewritten marriage to get a son. He had rewritten law to crush opposition. He had rewritten prayer to be said in his own tongue. But what he could not rewrite, what no man can ever truly rewrite, was the frailty of the human body, the aching, the leaking, the betrayal from within, and that, perhaps,
Silence. Do
is the
not
part that
speak
frightens
of
us
my
most.
leg again.
Not that he was
Your
cruel,
Majesty,
or
I
grand,
beg your pardon.
or gluttonous, but that in the end, the King of England died like any other man, gasping, decaying, afraid. So tonight, as you lay your head down, as you breathe gently in the dark, you know this power cannot protect you from your body. Glory cannot outshine rot. And even the loudest kings are eventually silenced, not by the will of God, not by the force of enemies, but by something small, something slow, something festering. Sometimes, a kingdom does not fall with a sword. Sometimes, it falls with a wound that never healed. Good night, Majesty. You ruled too long. You died too slowly. You refused to disappear. But now at last you must sleep.